I left sort of consultancy about a couple of years ago to form my own little consultancy company. And one of the reasons I did that was I wanted to start a blog about asset management and a blog that asks questions. So it's called The Wandering Asset Manager, Wandering WA and Wandering WO. So I risk between the two of those. And the blog is to ask questions and to say, well, nobody has all of the answers, not even the consultants out there. So what about? What do we think about? And where in the world are they doing this well? And that's part of the reason why I wanted to join the ALN. I'm very pleased to be a senior fellow. Is I'm looking to find out how things work in different parts of the world and say, well, is there something from here that transfers from here? And that's very much what I want to bring to the ALN as well as get from it. So Wandering Asset Manager, please do check it out. You can comment or reply back to me. Or if anyone wants to guest that blog, it's not just me. We have guest bloggers on there as well. So if somebody's got a subject that they want to put on there, then please do. But stakeholder capitalism really has come from the World Economic Forum, Davos man, and hopefully now Davos woman as well, looking at capitalism since the 1980s and saying, well, we need to do something to balance this business about stakeholder primacy. And the reason why I think this is key for asset management is a lot of asset-owning organisations that are shareholder-owned probably have this challenge of how to reconcile things like shareholder value and shareholder primacy with other things, intangibles such as the environment, sustainability, and all of these things. And I think although stakeholder capitalism wasn't conceived purely for asset management, it's come from Davos and the American, I think it's the American Chamber of Commerce and the British Chamber of Commerce and the World Economic Council. I think it offers something for asset management and particularly organisations in that shareholder situation that I think we've struggled with since the 80s, since the principle of shareholder primacy. In Ireland and in a few countries, they have this concept of an organisation which is not the state, but it's owned by the state. So the organisation I worked for was AVEA, which looked after gas and water. And that was a company, an organisation with profit and loss, but it was solely owned by the government. And that's actually, I think, a good solution to not having too much political interference, but equally giving some guidance. And again, this links back to difference between stakeholder organisations and owner organisations. So the concept of semi-state, Indonesia has the same with their power and their critical infrastructure, and Malaysia as well. I've lived my life through this in the UK. In the 1980s, we had the Thatcher government, which had an ideology of privatisation, and it worked for some asset classes and it didn't work for others. And I have an opinion on it. It worked well for gas and it worked well for power and power generation. But it didn't work well for water because of the nature of those different things. And it hasn't worked well for instance, the rail network because it's fragmented it. So I think ideology is sometimes the enemy of good practice asset management, because you should look at the asset and say, what is the right ownership? Is it state, semi-state, privately owned, or PPP, PFI, which I think known as P3 or 3P, which I think offers a lot in some of these circumstances, and I know it's getting more popular around the world. Ironically, as it gets less popular here because of the early mistakes. I think ownership has a lot to do with the culture that you get. If you think about state-owned assets and almost the old, people would join and they'd join as an apprentice and they'd be with the organisation, and there'd really be this word stewardship, which I think is a very positive word as far as asset management is concerned. So I think the ownership status almost gives that culture, and then that culture really drives the asset management. It's hard for the asset management to drive against that culture. So I think if you go into state-owned or semi-state, you can feel that there's a different culture created by that. It gives the space to say, well, we're going to do the right thing, as opposed to it's the bottom line, it's the bottom line. So I think there's that. Also, the different culture of different countries then feeds into asset management very interestingly. So Southeast Asia, it's a lot about compliance. So they're very highly, when you go and audit there, it's very hard actually to pick things up that are non-compliant because they're very good at doing compliance. So I think there's two aspects in there. Yes, I think the challenge everywhere is that difference between cost and profit and value. And I think, to be more specific, the challenge isn't saying, well, this is how we link health and well-being to value, but this is how we actually walk the talk when it comes down to making two decisions. When you come down to that decision where purely financially it's A, but if you look at that value, it's B, that's the point where the rubber hits the road. That's the point where the organisation either means it or not. So I think that's the challenge, and I don't see anyone particularly good at that. I think the Australians have probably done a lot with their fair value accounting, but it's kind of reached a point where it hasn't got through into the boardroom yet. They've not made that break, and this is where stakeholder capitalism could come in as well. But we need to be ready to explain what it means in the detail to the people who have had the ideas. So I think it's going to be an interesting time over the next few years. The other disappointments, ISO 5511, the government or the intended standard or guidance for policy for government in asset management, not really making it through to the end tape. And I know, Jim, you know more about the trials and tribulations of publishing ISOs than me. And it's quite a disappointment that didn't actually make its way through to the finish line.
Going to stakeholder capitalism, do you think that'll make less distinction between government and private in the way assets are considered managed?
I think it should, but the cynic in me says that with the stakeholder capitalism, that unless it is somehow mandated or signed up to, it'll actually provide a disincentive to do it, because the organisations that consider those intangibles might put themselves at a competitive disadvantage. So I think at the moment within it, my balance is feeling that it's a good idea. It might lead to another conversation, but it's not strong enough. It's not being pushed strongly enough or taken up strongly enough to flip it into that. And about my, governments should be working like that. That was definitely a bit of tongue-in-cheek irony that the governments haven't figured that out fully yet anyway. And I guess if the shareholder is the thing pulling you in maybe the wrong direction in the private sector, the politics is probably doing the same in the public sector. My favourite one is Gas Networks Ireland, formerly Bord Gosh, and Bord Gosh means the gas board in Irish. Now Gas Networks Ireland, and I first came across them in 2013, and I think fair to say they were a good organisation then. For a number of sound reasons. They had a very good succession strategy of moving people around through the organisation. So they, somebody would be in operations, then they'd be in safety, and somebody else would move from safety, into maintenance, into strategy. So they were a good organisation anyway, and they saw asset management as a good way of starting to bring these things together. They saw a need for it, and they went to PAS 55. And during their program to get PAS 55, the ISO was launched, so they swapped at the last minute and got ISO in 2015. And then since then, they've had a couple of improvement programs. And I guess the reasons why I think they are so good is because they had a good culture to start with, of moving people around and very long-term planning. Also, I think they undertook continual improvement, and I think transformational change is a buzzword. A lot of people are selling transformational change. We'll transform your business. And I think when you get to a certain level of maturity above, for instance, ISO 55000, transformational change actually doesn't get you that much more. And this is just my opinion, and I'm really interested in stories to the contrary or arguments to the contrary. I think you get to a certain point and the transformation actually provides more disruption than it does improvement, and you end up just changing things around and not getting any improvement. I think there's a point where the organization's got to look at itself, and it's got to be competent to look at itself and then analyze what it sees and say, we need to make a change now. Good is not good enough. We want to get better. We want to get great. And I think one of the things about GNI, and also one of their problems, is they never admit that they're really good at something. So I have trouble actually saying, you're really good at this. But that drives them to say, well, we want to get a little bit better. And their means of getting better is to do management review in the proper management system sense and get better. The last thing that they're doing now is integrating management systems. So 9000 for quality, 14,000 for environment, 50,000 for energy, and 45,000 for safety, and 55 for asset management. So they're looking to integrate those management systems and gain efficiencies out of bringing groups together and making those connections. And I think they're going to do it well. I think that's one of the next frontiers, is asset management not looking in on itself, but actually looking out and integrating further. Can I be provocative and actually say that there's a flip side of this, that if you did ISO 9000 right and you had your objectives correct, would you need any of the other of the management systems? And a few people have asked me this: could you do it all with 9000 if one of your objectives was doing good asset management? And that's a really provocative question.
Yeah, no, that's good. I know of one example of that. Ramesh Gulati, who is a member of the US TAG, has been a delegate to several of the international meetings, works with the Air Force, I believe, in Tennessee, I think. And that's what they've done. When they started the development, his point of view was, well, we're already doing this, and we use 9001 to do it. And it brought a lot of insight to the question. Interesting. So, Ark, you're going to be a senior fellow. So, any ideas of what you'd like to bring to the table, or how can we help, or anything like that?
So I think I can help with all the normal things, like I've helped write SAMPs and all of these things. But I think what I'd like to offer up mainly is do you want 3 or 4 different versions of how this has happened before somewhere else? So I think the main thing I'd like to offer is if you think that there may be other ways of doing this, I'd definitely like to offer the services of saying, well, actually there are 2 or 3, and I'll probably have some backup information from those organizations or contacts. So that's one of the things I'd like to bring. I'm doing a lot recently in the water sector. So I'm really coming home. I started off in the water sector, at the beginning of my career, and went via nuclear, rail, and a load of others. But I'm coming back to water now on waterways. So if there's anything in the water sector in particular to offer. So it's probably those 2 things that I can offer the ALN, and are looking for, the way you're developing things and what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, we are about what our members can do and can make happen, and how we can help and support each other.